Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today I'm going to talk more about the filming of a Walton Easter and a number of things that were different by the time we got to shooting this, our last Walton reunion special. If you're enjoying these, please do hit like and subscribe. By the time we got to filming this, our last reunion special, things had changed on the Warner Brothers lot. So some of the locations that we always used were still there. Some of them had changed, and the house itself was no longer on the back lot of the Waltons, the Warner Brothers lot. It had been moved. At one point there had been a fire on the back lot of the studio. The house exterior had burned. They had then rebuilt it, and we used that for some of the reunions that we filmed. But for this one, by the time we did this one, it had been moved to the Warner Ranch, which is a couple blocks away. So it was very interesting going over there to film the exterior because it felt different. You know, I walked into the set and there were other logistics to the yard. The yard wasn't as big in the front. And over towards where the barn was. They did rebuild a barn and they created a mill area there, but that used to be where the old mill was. And then of course in later episodes, the new mill was built, and that was off from to the other side of the house. Whereas in this case, on that lot, there wasn't space over there. It was just all like trees or other sets or things like that. So we couldn't use that area. So we were working in a smaller, more condensed space that we had available on this other lot. So they just built out more of what had been the old mill and created it as the only mill. So when you see John and Ben and Drew all working over there, that was the only space we had. On the front porch, the swing. In pretty much all of the series, the swing faced sideways on the porch. So when we had scenes, if someone was sitting on the porch and there was all the chairs, we were all sort of facing each other. In this instance, they have now changed the swing so it is facing forward and facing the front yard. So when Drew and Elizabeth spend time sitting on that porch, and where they actually finally get engaged at the end, towards the end of the episode, this is all on that porch, and that swing is facing forward. The kitchen also had a number of differences from when we shot the series. Of course, we have advanced from the 40s into the 60s, nearly the 70s. So the old wood-burning stove is no longer there, and we have what would have been more modern stove for the time period. However, there used to be between the stove and the counter and cabinets a door that finally I figured we discovered that it was sort of a pantry area. There's no door there anymore. So the stove has been moved over and sort of blocks where that wall space was. And I think, the refrigerator looks newer, things like that. So the kitchen, the table, it's a different wooden table. It isn't as rustic as the original table that we used in the series. I noticed when we were shooting towards the mill, and you could see there was a tree, but it was kind of right up against sort of almost the barn area. And I went, I don't think there's a treehouse up there, because that, of course, over by the mill was where that wonderful tree was with the tire swing and the treehouse. A little later in the episode, when Elizabeth and John Boy have a scene in the treehouse, you see John Boy come out of the house and come straight down into the yard, and the tree is now literally like a ladder, as opposed to climbing things on the tree. And the treehouse is now in a different tree that didn't really exist in our front yard before. So that was certainly very different. We were able to use parts of the back lot because a lot of it is Drusilla's pond. So that aspect, that area. And also when we see parts of town, there's different areas where we do see sets that we used to work with in the past. There's one point in a Drusilla's pond scene where I think it might have been at another location, because the Weeks house, you see a big sort of field behind them. So I have a feeling wherever we went to shoot that may have been a location where might have been Franklin Canyon, might have been Fraser Park. So they were able to utilize a different body of water, I think, on a couple of occasions. So that, but I'm not positive about that one. When we go to the Baldwin's house, the set is completely different. Now we could imagine that, the Baldwin's house is a pretty good sized house. So this just could be a different room within the Baldwin's house, but we were very used to that parlor area where scenes always took place, where there was the fireplace with the judge's picture over the fireplace and the piano. In this case, you see an upright piano sort of in the background, as opposed to that grand piano that used to be in their space. So because that was always an interior set, I guess they decided that not to try to recreate that whole set. Perhaps even finding those pieces was difficult. So we take a leap of faith that this is just a different room in the Baldwin's house. I do remember shooting that very early sunrise service scene. Although it is light, it doesn't necessarily look like it's sunrise when that sequence is seen. But in order to have the kind of light they wanted, I remember having a very early call, and we were on location, so it meant really early to be transported to location. And then, so it was dark, and you're like going into wardrobe and makeup, and it's dark and it's cold, and but it's a beautiful sequence. So that sometimes is what happens. And when they want those, like literally, if you want a sunrise shot, and it's going to be very early, and everything needs to be completely set up, and they will have had to scout it at another time to figure all that out. And they always keep track of when's sunrise and when's sunset. But beautiful to have that open sense of nature in that final service. I believe the scene with John Boy and Verdi in town was someplace on the Warner Brothers lot. And then when Elizabeth and Aaron have a scene in sort of a little diner or whatever, that was a set on Midwest where it was what we would call a practical set, where they were able to shoot actually in that building where it was. And then when they leave and they're looking across at where Drew's girlfriend has walked off, you see a piece of the gazebo, and you see what was actually the schoolhouse. And then there's points where you see some of what was the brick of Boatwright University. So a lot of those we were able to still utilize familiar areas to me, but not necessarily having them function the same way they did before, because clearly we used a different schoolhouse. Although the exterior of the schoolhouse was the same when we saw when Olivia was teaching. When we got to the interior, it was a different interior set than what we would normally use. And I don't know if that was an actual interior someplace or whether it was on a soundstage. I just don't remember because I wasn't in those scenes. It also appeared that when John Boy was in that cabin, and then a number of the kids come to help plan the anniversary party, that was also a practical set. For one thing, you can hear a bit of echo in the dialogue at one point, so I think that was because of that space. And it just has that whole rustic feel, and when you look outside, it looks like the actual area outside as opposed to a painted backdrop. Now, when we talk about the inconsistencies in continuity, first off, it's supposed to be John and Olivia's 40th anniversary, and yet we're saying it's the moon landing, which was July of 1969, and we're saying it's going to be Easter. So that is immediately a what? I kept going back and forth going, am I misunderstanding this? But that's what was said. So there we go. And that John and Olivia, that timeline doesn't work, because that would have meant that they were married in 1929 and the homecoming took place in 1933, where we already had the 7 children. So None of that made any sense either. So we were just asked to suspend belief for a period of time. Why they didn't want to make it their 40th or 50th anniversary, I have no idea, but there you go. I think we loved the celebration regardless of whether the timelines were accurate. There were, of course, various different characters that were unexplained in terms of their absence. We see Ben throughout, but we never see his wife Cindy, and she's never mentioned. We see Jason and his wife Tony, but there's no mention of Jonesy or John Curtis, although you see my two other children. So there's different things like that where people seem to be missing. We did see Grandma. We saw Ellen Corby. She made a couple of little appearances, so it was great to have her, just her presence there in the show. That felt right to us. I've also been asked if the youngest of Jason and Tony's children was in fact their own real life daughter, and yes, this is John's daughter. That's what I have for you for this behind the scenes, more in-depth look at the filming and the locations and everything for a Walton Easter. I'll be back with more behind the scenes of the Waltons and more Ask Judy. Thanks for watching.